Mouthwashing is an incredible and desperately dark indie game produced by Wrong Organ, following the crew of a transport delivery spaceship and what happens to them. The story itself is fairly straightforward once you understand the timeline of events, but the game shines in its use of symbolism, connections and references that really elevate the story being told. Today on the Panopticon Theatre, we'll be going through Mouthwashing and trying to break down exactly what happened and analyse the details, choices and hidden elements that make this game so clever and impactful. In this video, I want to dissect the symbolism and hidden meanings within the game, so I won't focus too much on a literal breakdown of the story, since it's fairly clear anyways, but for avoidance of doubt on the narrative, here's a super quick rundown of the story of the game in chronological order. Curly and Jimmy are old friends, Curly being the captain of the cargo ship Tulpa for a shipping company called Pony Express. Jimmy appears to have had a rough past, and whilst it's not clear exactly what he did, he's not well looked upon. Curly helps him get a job as his co-pilot. The other crew are Swansea, an older mechanic with a lot of experience but not a great attitude, and Anya, a nurse who repeatedly failed to get into medical school. The ship is designed for 4 crew, with only 4 of the emergency cryopods and a minimal food supply, but a last-minute addition is made. Daisuke, a young man whose parents wanted him to get into work. He acts as the apprentice to Swansea, though whilst he has a good attitude, he's not particularly good at mechanics and is quite clumsy. They're transporting an unknown cargo they're not supposed to access over the course of 382 days. Along the journey, Jimmy treats the regular mental evaluations given by Anya as a joke, and Curly lets him largely brush them off, though he offers to do one for Jimmy himself so Anya doesn't have to handle it. During this, he comments to Jimmy that he's not sure if this job is really for him, despite having reached the top of the ladder in it. Jimmy says he likes the power he gets from being co-pilot, so we get a pretty clear idea of his character here. Shortly after, Curly discovers in a message from the company that Pony Express is going under and their jobs are void after the shipment, and whilst they'll be paid, none of them will have employment once they land, and will have little prospects aside from Curly, who would get a good recommendation, and Daisuke, who would have his parents' support. He's recommended not to tell the crew until right before their destination, but a few days later he decides he can't keep it from them. However, when he goes to tell them, they're throwing him a birthday party, and he has to awkwardly tell them right before they eat cake. This creates a huge amount of tension for the crew. At some point on the journey, Jimmy sexually assaults Anya. It's not clear if this was a repeated or one-time event. We know this was assault due to her mentioning the lack of locks on the sleeping quarters doors when they're there on the medical bay in the cockpit, and also her discussion about hiding the gun from him. Her discomfort with feeding Curly his meds later may also be connected. Anya reports this to Curly, but he doesn't do much more than speaking to him about it. Anya later discovers she's pregnant, which she tells Curly also, and it's clear she'll have the baby before they land. She lets Jimmy know about it around 147 days into the journey, and Jimmy snaps, deciding to crash the ship into an asteroid in their path so that they'll all die instead of him having to reach their destination and face the consequences of his actions or deal with his job loss. He gives Curly an indication of what he's going to do, and Curly runs in to stop him, however too late, and he's horribly burned in the cockpit, losing an eye, most of his skin, and his ability to speak. The ship's protective emergency foam activates to protect it, and the others are all fine. The rest of the crew think Curly did it due to him being in the cockpit, and Jimmy takes over as captain. Anya struggles to keep Curly alive despite the lack of resources and the fact that giving him painkillers makes her nauseous. Jimmy sometimes takes over giving him painkillers to his annoyance, and it's implied he deliberately hurts Curly whilst doing so at least once. His sanity is also struggling, and he's having severe hallucinations and delusions. Swansea is also not letting anyone into the utility room, which he claims is filled with foam. Eventually, due to dwindling resources, they agree to open the cargo. They discover it is tons and tons of mouthwash. Anya says the mouthwash is useless for medical reasons due to the sugar content, whereas Swansea's focus is the alcohol content, with which he decides to break his many years of sobriety, encouraging Daisuke to do so as well. At some point, Anya has a private conversation with Swansea in which she likely tells him what Jimmy did to her, causing Swansea to be constantly aggravated with Jimmy. Swansea still has an axe from earlier in the flight that Curly gave him to break Daisuke out of some emergency foam. 5 months after the crash, Anya locks herself in medical with Curly, saying some fairly worrying things, and they assume she's going to kill Curly. Daisuke reveals to Jimmy that they could access medical through the vent in utility, which before the crash we learned was off-limits and extremely dangerous. Jimmy makes a cocktail using isopropyl alcohol and mouthwash, which he gives to Swansea to knock him out, allowing them to access the room, which they discover is not full of foam and still has one working cryopod, which Jimmy assumes Swansea saved for himself, though it's more than likely implied that he saved it for Daisuke. Jimmy manipulates Daisuke into going through the vent, and whilst he does manage to unlock the medical door, he gets severely injured in the process. With medical open, it's revealed Anya overdosed on the painkillers, killing herself. Due to the fact that they use the isopropyl in the cocktail, they have nothing to treat Daisuke with aside from mouthwash, which makes it worse, as Anya had said, though of course Jimmy disregarded that. Swansea ends up mercy killing him with the axe. Jimmy gets the gun from the safety case, and Swansea tries to attack him with the axe. Jimmy is able to tie him to a chair, and Swansea gives what I think is one of the best monologues in gaming for a long time, about how as much as he tried to turn his life around and be a good working man to care for his kids, at the end he was happiest when he was at the peak of his alcoholism. Jimmy shoots him dead. At this point, Jimmy has completely snapped, and he props the dead bodies up in a mock birthday party, hallucinating that they are alive and celebrating him. He puts Curly on the table and cuts off a chunk of his leg, eating it and feeding it to Curly. We see a series of delusions which are projections of his regrets about what he did to Daisuke, Swansea and Curly, and about the crash and pregnancy, though he doesn't have one relating directly to what he did to Anya. In fact, during a sequence when he's walking through a corridor full of flying ID cards, in which the ID cards can also be seen plastered across the walls, Anya's card isn't even there. He almost completely disregards her and what he did. The final part of this sequence shows Polly, the company mascot, on a pile of empty mouthwash bottles, and he speaks to Jimmy with the only moment of fully voiced dialogue in the game. Parts of the sequence treat Polly as if it was the baby Jimmy impregnated Anna with, which we'll discuss the meaning of later, but it continues here, as Polly asks if he should call Jimmy old man, but says it's a little above his pay grade, tying back to earlier, when Jimmy told Anya titles should be earned. Polly taunts him, and Jimmy talks about how Curly is a better man than him, and how Jimmy is taking responsibility and trying to fix it and save Curly. Polly then hits him with the incredibly cutting line, This points out how Jimmy is obsessed with Curly, how originally he'd put Curly on a strange pedestal, implying both that his job is higher station than it is, then suggesting Curly was happy with the company going under so he can move up in life, then used him as a vessel to escape responsibility for the crash, etc. Then later how Jimmy's guilt was so focused around Curly and how not a single thought of his was spared for Anya, what he did to her, or the fact that that was what caused all of this in the first place. The closest he got to even thinking of Anya was the hallucinations related to the pregnancy, which were all distant from the idea of even a woman being involved. Everything is abstracted and monstrous. It shows how at the end, Jimmy not only didn't feel any guilt or responsibility for what he did to her, he didn't even really consider it wrongdoing at all. Daisuke gets a grave, Swansea gets a monologue, and Curly gets this whole apology scene, but Anya gets disregarded entirely. Jimmy carries Curly to the remaining cryopod and shuts him in there, claiming he fixed it. As the cryopod freezes Curly in, he goes off screen and shoots himself. And the final nail in the coffin is that he doesn't even wait to see if the pod actually turns on. In the end, he doesn't care what actually happens to Curly, as long as he feels he finally took responsibility and fixed things. So that's the game. Once it's in chronological order, it's fairly clear to understand what happens narratively, but there's a lot of clever uses of symbolism and theme in the game that will now work on breaking down. Let's get into it. The name choices in Mouthwashing are very deliberate and significant, and each character has some pretty significant symbols and references associated with them. Firstly, Anya's name is a very clear one. The name Anya is used across many cultures and with many variations, but particularly in Hungarian means mother. Anya is also a Russian variation on Anna, which means grace, but is also the name of Saint Anna, alternatively called Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary and patron of unmarried women, housewives, women in labour or who want to be pregnant, grandmothers, mothers, and interestingly, equestrians, a point which we'll discuss later. Her surname, according to her ID card, appears to be Musume, which is a Japanese surname meaning daughter, so a pretty clear and consistent theme there. As for her design, she's specifically based on Shelley Duvall in The Shining, which also has some similar themes to Mouthwashing. I'll discuss that a bit further when we dive into references in the game. For Daisuke, we don't know the specific kanji used to write his name, so it could have several meanings. The dai typically means big, and the kanji for assist and help are fairly common for suge. It could also be some other words such as bless, law, or mediate. Big help or big assist are the most likely candidates in my opinion, considering his role. His surname on his ID card is pretty hard to read. The most consistent reading I've seen people have is Juarez, but it could also be a very squiggly version of a name like Kida. It's too hard to read to get a clear name, so I won't look too deep into it, but if you're good at reading signatures, can you decipher it? The hibiscus he's associated with can symbolize youth and short life, considering they only bloom for a few days, and they may be offered in honor of the dead. There are some other, less well-sourced pieces of symbolism for pink hibiscus, particularly around the idea of platonic or familial love. He's also based on a character from a movie, Ryosuke Kawashima from Kairo, a Japanese horror film from 2001. I don't think there's quite as much connection with Kairo as there is with The Shining, but it's still worth a mention. Swansea is the name of a Welsh city. The original meaning was related to the bank or mouth of a river, which you could abstractly connect to his alcoholism. The city also had a nickname that could interestingly apply to Swansea, the Graveyard of Ambition. In context of his monologue, that seems to fit in pretty well. As a port city, it also relates to his years of labour for Pony Express. His surname looks something like Harold, which means mighty army, but maybe another similar looking name. There's also a connection to swans in his name, of course, which is emphasised by the swan on his keychain. Notably, swans have been observed to kill their young if they're sick, injured, or otherwise unlikely to make it in the wild. There's also the idea of a swan song, which is a metaphorical phrase for a final gesture, effort, or performance given just before death or retirement. This ties in pretty well with how Swansea reacts to the realization that they're not going to survive. He immediately falls back into complete alcoholism despite his many years of sobriety, and is willing to go all out and try to kill Jimmy right at the end after everything. The idea of a swan song comes from the mistaken but common belief that swans only sing at the end of their life but are otherwise mute, which may connect to how Swansea didn't really do much about Jimmy or anything until right at the end, just before he died. Speaking of Jimmy, his name is typically a diminutive of James, which comes from the name Jacob from Hebrew. This name is given the meaning supplanter, associated with the story of Esau and Jacob in the Bible. Jacob is the younger brother who tricks Esau into giving Jacob his birthright or his position as the elder son to receive a blessing. Connect this to Jimmy's supplanting of Curly. As for his surname, it's also very hard to read. I've seen people suggest it looks like Zaire or Zane. What do you think? There's a lot of symbolism with Jimmy connected to horses, which we'll cover in a whole section of this video later. As for Curly, we can see from his ID this is actually his surname. His forename looks very much like Grant to me, but could also be Clint or something similar. Their meanings don't appear massively relevant. Curly itself is a much more interesting name, which is probably why it's what people refer to him as. In particular, it was the nickname of Laika, a dog who was one of the first animals in space. Laika was never intended to survive her mission, instead used as a testing method for how living beings would survive in space, which is interesting to compare to Curly, who, whilst he technically doesn't die as far as we see, was unlikely to have ever been rescued, and would probably have died after his time in the cryopod was up. It's also interesting to compare to Pony Express's motives and interests. Laika also died of hypothermia or overheating, much as Curly was burned by the crash. The state that Curly's left in after the crash is deeply ironic. He stood by and didn't intervene with Jimmy when Anya told him what happened, and then was stuck in a situation where he was unable to do anything but watch the events going on, completely losing his bodily autonomy and ability to act at all. It's also something to connect to the dead pixel from his scene with Anya. Once she's seen it, she can't get it out of her head, but Curly can only see the big picture and can't pick it out, much like their individual relationships with Jimmy. The relevancy of horses in the game is particularly interesting. They crop up a whole lot, and I'm surprised I've not seen much analysis of this element. First of all, the company being called Pony Express is a very clear and direct reference to the original Pony Express, which was an American mail carrier service in the 1860s. It, fairly famously, pushed horse riders, usually teenage boys, on tough and fast routes across the states, prioritizing the safety and speed of the mail delivery over the safety of the riders. Even without what the game shows us of how Pony Express treats its employees, we can get a pretty clear picture of what type of company this is just from the name choice. Likewise, the name of the ship, the Tulpa, has its own meaning. A Tulpa is a mythical horse from Turkish legends, a winged heavenly horse with incredible speeds. It's a significant cultural symbol, which, whilst the intended symbolism that the company probably wanted to portray is very positive, when applied to a tiny dank metal ship out in space, it instead gives the impression of trying to glitz up a pretty miserable situation. There's also, of course, Polly, the mascot. The name likely comes from the Swedish Polle, which is a colloquial term for a horse like horsey in English. Of all the meaningful names the characters in the game have, it's the most direct and simple, and combined with its cartoonish design, it's clearly a pretty hollow mascot designed to give the company a friendly face through which to exercise its power. Power is a pretty common piece of symbolism ascribed to horses generally, usually in the context of something like military might, but they're also connected in particular to showing someone like a royal, general, or hero and their power over others. You've surely seen the abundance of statues and paintings of military figures on horses as opposed to just standing. It gives the figure a feeling of dominance and might over others, and historically has been seen as a signal of military might. Pony Express's use of horses as a symbol is, in my opinion, drawing on this particular element of horse symbolism. Polly as a mascot is a cartoonish and simple character, but nonetheless is still that signifier of power, as if designed to hide that exertion of power over the workers behind that friendly face. The blind horse creature in the sequence in the cargo hold is also in my eyes a part of this. There's two perceptions I have of this sequence. One is that the horse here represents the company, blind to its workers' struggle, but always pushing down the ones that make too much noise or cause too much trouble. Another is that it represents the inevitability of the fact that Jimmy's actions will come to light. We later see the horse connected directly to the imagery of the fetus, and the fact that the gameplay of this section involves sneaking around to avoid it connects to how Jimmy would prefer to completely avoid addressing what he did. Another frequent point of symbolism for horses is sexuality. Historically, we can see pieces of media depicting horses as a representation of sexual and erotic energy, and in several cases directly as symbolism of rape. Many historical tales of gods, particularly in Greek myth, has gods transforming into horses to mate with humans, and the idea of being trampled by a horse is often connected to a depiction of rape. It's pretty clear how this connects to Jimmy as a symbol, and he connects to both this symbolism and the symbolism of power we discussed too, in him using his power over Anya to get what he wants. It's also interesting how places where Jimmy should really see Anya in his delusions, he sees Polly or horses instead. I do think Polly is representative of Anya to an extent, though I think it's more connected to the baby in his mind. But I think where it represents Anya, we can see through his appearance how Jimmy dehumanizes Anya, and even the fact that he replaces her with a male character in his mind is significant. And finally, another big piece of symbolism for horses is that of psychopomps, or guides for the dead, which is a pretty simple one connecting to how the crew all die. To circle back to Polly, it also seems like the Polly posters on the ship line up with the characters too.
Polly says,
Don't be daft, proper preparation prevents accidents. It's your responsibility to keep yourself and the crew safe. Medical expenses will be docked from personal credits. This poster connects to Curly and how he failed to take responsibility and take action regarding Jimmy, leading to failing to keep the crew safe. The alternative version seen later in the game shows Polly with an axe, which he was the one to allow the crew access to for longer than they should have. The part about medical expenses also likely reflects how he was reliant on the crew's medical supply after the crash.
Polly says,
Lend a hand. Teamwork is the soul of success. When you've completed your tasks, always check on the other tasks. HR complaints about poor team synergy may result in collective punishment. This one connects to Jimmy and how he was the cause of the dissolution of the crew's interpersonal stability, which certainly led to collective punishment. The alternative version has the hands bloodied and Polly looking at the viewer, showing Jimmy's guilt and suggesting he has blood on his hands.
Polly says,
Rise and shine, sleep is the best after a long day of work, earn that rest. Don't overdo it or fall behind, do not indulge in over 5 hours of rest. This poster connects to Swansea and him being knocked out by the cocktail. The alternative version has Polly with mouthwash in his hands, which is pretty obvious.
Polly says,
Giddy up, Galaxy, punctual delivery is our pride and promise, no matter where you are. Late deliveries will be docked from personal credits. Finally, this one connects to Anya and her pregnancy. There's no alternative version of this one showing how little Jimmy considered her. There's no poster connected to Daisuke, perhaps due to the fact that he wasn't supposed to be on the ship at all. The mouthwash itself is interesting to look at. First of all, there's the obvious fact that sending 5 people for a year in a tiny ship with bad food and pretty terrible working conditions just for a cargo of mouthwash is a pretty miserable concept. There's not really much value in wondering who ordered all this mouthwash and why or where it was going. That's not the point of it really. Of course, the creators clearly also took some artistic license with the mouthwash in general. Whilst mouthwash does have alcohol in it, it's not really the same type of alcohol that you drink to get drunk, and the amount they were drinking would almost certainly have killed them all pretty quick. But that's also not the point of it. It's there to show the callousness of Pony Express and of capitalism as a whole, and how needless the whole situation really was. The phrasing of its advertising is also interesting, particularly the kills 99% of germs part, which is emphasized and repeated in some of the flashing text. One reading of this is to connect it to Jimmy's actions and his attempt to wipe out the crew alongside all the things he did. Interestingly, a large amount of the bacteria mouthwash kills is not even the bacteria that contributes to tooth problems, it's just innocent bacteria that exists in the mouth, much like how Jimmy ends up getting the entire crew killed without ever actually resolving anything. These readings are certainly helped by the fact that the mouthwash isn't even a useful product itself, considering its sugar content. Mouthwash sometimes has artificial sweetness, but actual sugar content would render any dental benefits useless, something meant to help that actually ends up making things worse. And whilst it's a small thing that you can do to make you feel like you're taking care of your teeth, mouthwash won't fix actual problems with them like plaque or rot. It's a temporary measure that just covers up the smell, much like the way that Curly handles Jimmy, or rather doesn't handle him. In the end, Jimmy is desperate to feel redeemed without him ever actually having put any real work in to begin to make up for or resolve the things that he did. Let's break down the hallucinations or dream sequences or whatever you want to call these scenes. First of all, the Blood Ocean one before Jimmy's Psychoval. It's rare we get one that's from Curly, and honestly I'm pretty sure this one isn't actually a delusion Curly's having in the same way that Jimmy has delusions later, largely due to his complete lack of reaction to it after, and how we don't see him have any other hallucinations like this, though it could be one of course. To me, this scene is an abstraction of Curly ignoring Jimmy's red flags. He's literally walking past warning signs, and I think the ladders could be read as him ignoring potential outs or fixes for the problem. The sun is a bright, blinding light that he walks towards, and I think this represents Jimmy, something he's so focused on that he's blinded to the fact that he'll get burned. The Blood Ocean also appears to be a reference to Evangelion, which I'll mention more on in the references section later. A sea of blood generally is often a symbol of large amounts of bloodshed, which is probably foreshadowing to the crew's death. We discussed the cargo scene with the blind horse earlier, so not too much else to cover there. I don't know if the monologue sequence is technically a hallucination or if it actually happened, but I do think it probably did happen. I'll talk about it here because it's within a big sequence of hallucinations, so it fits. The main point of interest in symbolism here, to me, is the real-life images flashing behind Swansea. Not only is it a very cool visual, but to me it also suggests the idea of a realistic, simple life. The clips we see show what appear to be home video-like parts of a simple, regular life, something that Swansea was trying to achieve, but in the end, found it never really made him happy. I also think it may be a reference to a real-life image sequence from Evangelion. I'll talk more about connections with Evangelion in the references section. I'm not sure if it's meant to mean much in terms of a reference, but it's worth mentioning as there are several connections to Evangelion in the game. The vent sequence is fairly obviously his guilt over Daisuke's death. Him not being able to turn around is fairly clearly him recognizing he can't run away from what he did, especially supported by Daisuke's distorted and flashed face appearing when he does. We see the hibiscuses again, once again symbolic of a young life cut short. Then, the scene with him feeding Curly his leg and then the part in the TV where he apologizes to Curly is interesting. First of all, feeding Curly his own leg even if he vomits it up, once again shows us Jimmy's disregard for others and their bodily autonomy. It's also an instance of Jimmy's hero complex, how he wants to portray himself as helping others even when he's hurting them. Feeding Curly is in his eyes doing a good thing and helping him, but in reality he's hurting him worse in the process of doing so. Kind of similar to how aggressive he is when giving Curly medicine previously, though obviously a bit more extreme. The inclusion of the cartoon is an interesting choice. The cartoon shown is Mother Goose's birthday party, and in it, various of the Mother Goose associated characters throw a birthday party for Mother Goose, as suggested. All of the characters are invited except the big bad wolf. He nonetheless invites himself along, but fails to get in a few times. Then we see the sequence seen in the clip in Mouthwashing. After the bit we see cuts off, the wolf leaps out of the cake and attacks the guests. One of the guests wakes up Mighty Mouse, who handily defeats the wolf. I think this is an interesting choice of clip. One, it's cut off right before the wolf is revealed, which we can perhaps connect to Jimmy refusing to acknowledge his role as the villain or any culpability. The wolf breaking in to where he's not invited is also a pretty clear connection. But also, it's possible we could interpret Jimmy as him thinking of himself as Mighty Mouse in this clip. Jimmy does have both a hero and a victim complex. I wouldn't be surprised if he still considered his move to crash the ship and his prevention of the company's shutdown actually affecting them as a heroic choice, something that saves them, the way that he talked about it in his discussion with Curly right before the crash. Either way, I'm sure the fact that of it being a birthday scene isn't unintentional. Indeed, I think the use of birthday scenes is pretty deliberate to show Jimmy's self-centered nature. A birthday's a day to celebrate only one person and show your appreciation for them. Jimmy was dismissive of Curly's birthday party even before he broke the news, and him setting up the party later and having the dead crew celebrate him is another demonstration of him supplanting Curly's role and wanting the praise of the crew in a position of power. Then he apologizes to on-fire Curly in the TV. For one, I think it being kind of inside the TV is interesting as a choice. It's almost like it suggests the apology is a performance of a kind. It's certainly not an apology that's useful to anyone anyway. But it's clear from the scene how much he focuses on Curly and what effects he had on him, not at all on the original problem of what he did to Anya, as Polly brings up shortly later. He half idolizes Curly, half is incredibly jealous of him. He sees him as a hero, but also as someone who's trying to put the crew behind him after the news of the company being shut down. It's a very strange relationship. The scene of the ultrasound and Polly baby monster is fairly direct, going off what we discussed earlier regarding horses, but it's interesting that it comes right after the Curly apology, almost as if something in his psyche is trying to remind him Curly isn't the one he needs to apologize to. Whatever part of his subconscious that created this particular delusion clearly didn't get through to him though. He's still only focused on Curly, which is what Polly calls him out for. As we mentioned earlier, Anya's design is based on Shelley Duvall as Wendy Torrance in The Shining. There's other references to the movie and the game too, such as the scene with Swansea axing the door. It shares themes of mania and isolation, and of course the abuse of women. And Anya and Wendy Torrance have many similarities in their role in the story, but also in their personalities and ways of handling their abusers. It's a very interesting comparison. There's also quite a few mostly visual references to the Evangelion series, particularly stuff from End of Evangelion. For example, Curly's burn design is extremely similar to the design of the damaged Unit 01, the Blood Sea resembles the LCLC, and the text pop-ups are very similar to the Evangelion title card style. I'm going to give a quick spoiler for End of Evangelion here, so if you want to avoid that, skip to the timestamp on the screen now. I think the point of particular relevance here is Curly's design resembling Unit 01, due to what happens to 01 at the end of Evangelion. It's left adrift in space, still with Yui's soul in it, petrified and stuck alive forever. Very similar to how Curly's frozen in the cryopod, adrift in space. Another more obscure reference is the one we see on this TV. It includes a channel talking about atoms, and the specific things it references as being made of atoms are specifically from a poem, The Walrus and the Carpenter, by Lewis Carroll. The poem is, in typical style of Carroll, very abstract, but it follows a walrus and a carpenter walking on the beach, who ask oysters to follow them. They sit to rest, and the oysters ask to take a break. This is where we see the lines. "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and where the pigs have wings." The sea being boiling hot leads to the oysters being cooked and eaten by the pair. The walrus laments the oysters' death and chats with them beforehand, saying how nice they all are, though he still eats them all, whereas the carpenter is focused entirely on eating them. "It seems a shame," the walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing but, the butter's spread too thick." The poem ends with all the oysters being eaten. The poem can be considered to be about greed and abuse of power over those who look up to you or are inferior to you. We can compare in this poem the walrus to Curly and the carpenter to Jimmy. The carpenter is the aggressive one who cares for nothing more than getting what he wants, and the walrus is the one who's friendly with the oysters and cries over their deaths but makes no real effort to save them. This poem also has an instance of the walrus seemingly trying to distract the oysters from their incoming fate by pointing out the beauty of the night, similar perhaps to the scene with Curly and Anya in the night sky screen. Also at the start, the sun is shining on the ocean in the middle of the night, similar to the Blood Sea sequence, and also interesting in relation to Jimmy and Anya, in that the moon, referred to with feminine pronouns, is annoyed or upset by the sun, referred to with male pronouns, forcibly inserting itself into her territory, the night, but the sun shines aggressively, disregarding her feelings. This seems a lot to read into an easily skipped over line in the TV sections, but with how much the devs considered other small symbolic factors, I wouldn't be surprised if this was an intended link, even if a very obscure one. Here are some other smaller bits of symbolism and my thoughts that didn't fit elsewhere in this video. Swansea breaking the sky screen with his axe is possibly intended as foreshadowing to how he kills Daisuke later, particularly with how he refers to Daisuke as a useless ray of sunshine. The breaking of the screen possibly also symbolises the one dead pixel that was once unnoticed by the rest of the crew, now becoming something unavoidable to look at. The damage to the ID cards that we see reflects how each of the crew died. Anya's being visually intact shows that all her damage, the stuff that killed her, was on the inside and not visible to others. As an aside, she's also the only one who dies with both her eyes intact, possibly due to her being the only one to see Jimmy's true nature. Her name is also the only one in capitals on the card, which I'm not sure of the significance of, if any, perhaps just an error. Daisuke's has a slash through it, Swansea's has holes like his gunshots, Kelly's is burned completely beyond recognition. The locations they're found in are also reasonably relevant. Jimmy's is near the Polly statue, possibly reflecting his desire for command over others in relation to the company. Anya's being in a cupboard possibly reflects her desire for a safe hidden place on the ship. Curly's is next to the cryopod, which foreshadows where he ends up. Daisuke's is next to the game board, which reflects his innocence, but also, this particular game has several names, such as Parcheesi and Ludo, but one variant is called Sorry, possibly reflecting how Daisuke is apologising when he dies. I'm not sure if there's too much significance to Swansea's being at the coffee machine. What do you think? On the subject of ID cards, whilst everyone largely looks the same as their ID photo, Jimmy looks a little different, a bit older and rougher looking than his model. We generally only see him from Curly's perspective, so it's possible that this portrays Curly having a more positive, idealised view of him than he actually is. Jimmy's rant during the first birthday scene is oddly reflective of himself, so I guess you got what you wanted without the guilt, and you just couldn't frame it to yourself in a way that kept you as a hero in particular. Jimmy certainly projects a lot on Curly. I want to discuss a little bit the scene where Swansea breaks the door with the axe, and that I'm pretty sure it didn't happen, or at least that it isn't exactly how things went down. Chronologically, if we look at the order of events, Jimmy already has the gun at this point. He goes straight from Daisuke's dead body to the cockpit and pulls out the gun. This is the object in his inventory. He grabs a metal pipe and rope, which we see him use to barricade the door as Swansea attacks. However, we get absolutely no indication from after the scene of Daisuke's death that Swansea was moving to or thinking about attacking Jimmy. In fact, he straight up tells Jimmy that he doesn't care what he does, and to go get in the cryopod if that's what he wants. Swansea is resigned, and has everything he wants in the ship. I do think Jimmy got the rope and pipe, but not to barricade the door. We see Swansea tied up during the monologue. I suspect Jimmy used the pipe to attack him, and obviously the rope to tie him up before he shot him. I think the graveyard scene is a deep abstraction of the actual events. Jimmy chasing down Swansea through the ship and subduing him before tying him up. It does end with Swansea in the utility room, but it's likely they moved through the ship as they fought, rather than it all culminating in the cockpit where it started. So why do we see Swansea break the door down? At this point, Jimmy is beyond an unreliable narrator. He's completely delusional. I wouldn't be surprised if this is an imagined event for his own psyche to assuage his guilt over deciding to kill Swansea. If he could imagine the dead crew alive and talking to him, it's not a stretch to imagine that he could hallucinate Swansea attacking him and use that as justification for chasing him down and killing him. The screens of the ship seemingly being stuck in twilight mode could represent that the crew is almost stuck in time, or that this is their sundown. During the first party scene, Jimmy does call it the Twilight Cruise of the Tulpa. Holly being the only voiced character is a very interesting choice. His voice is of course distorted, but a voice nonetheless. I interpret this as perhaps being that Polly's voice, or rather the voice of the company, is the only one that will report on the situation, the only one that will reach back to Earth, the only one that others will hear. Nobody else will be able to say what happened on the ship. Everyone else is dead, and Curly can't speak even if he does get rescued, which I highly doubt he would. There you have it, that's my complete analysis of all the symbolism and references I picked up in Mouthwashing. I'm sure there's some I missed out on, or stuff that you interpret differently, so let me know what you thought in the comments. It's clear the devs put a whole lot of thought into this game even beyond the already really well crafted story, and I love delving into it. I'll definitely be keeping an eye on what these devs do in the future, and I recommend you do too. And should I analyse their other work, How Fish is Made too? That's equally interesting to me, so let me know if you'd like to see me dig into it. Thanks for watching today's Panopticon Theatre performance. What do you think? Did I miss anything? What do you want me to talk about next? Make sure to sub and join the audience if you want to see more.